really thrilled to have Lynell George here. Before we introduce her, I want to just do some introductory comments. So first of all, I really want to thank Chloe and the Altadena Library for helping us with the technical part of this presentation. The library has been a great partner to us over the years, and through the pandemic, they've just really stepped up to help us ensure that we can continue with our quarterly program. So we really appreciate it. And then before we dive into our program, just some notes in case you didn't hear Chloe say it earlier. We do have the chat disabled for now. We're going to turn it on maybe at around 7:30. So start thinking about your questions that you might want to ask Lynell, and you can, starting about 7:30, we'll put those in the chat and Chloe will help us moderate those questions. Otherwise, we're just going to keep people on mute so that the listening experience can be as good as it can be for everyone. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the Altadena Historical Society in case you're not familiar with us or what we do. So we have been in Altadena since 1935, preserving, collecting, and sharing the history of our wonderful community. And although our archives are closed currently due to the pandemic, we are trying to continue our quarterly programs, and we are continuing to collect. So as we see things coming through the newspapers or, we hear about interesting stories, we're continuing to work on our mission of collecting that history so we can continue sharing it with you all. Throughout this presentation, you'll be seeing us just put a link in if you want to donate to us. We are 100% member funded, so we appreciate any donations people can make. We'll also be putting a link in to purchase the book at a discounted rate. So big thank you to Angel City Press for providing us that discount. It's really wonderful. AHS is also on Facebook and Instagram, so if you're a social media kind of person, check us out there. So what we're going to do tonight is I've got some questions for Lynell. We're just going to walk through some questions and have a conversation here. And then, maybe at about 7:40, 7:45, we'll open it up for you. So excuse my dog. We will open it up for you to ask any questions that you might have. And like I said, we'll do that through the chat because that's just easier. And then we'll wrap it up. We are recording the session, so it'll be available for viewing after tonight. So thank you all for joining us. I'm really thrilled to introduce Lynell George. It's just such an honor to have her here. Her book is just so amazing. So just in case you haven't seen the book, Handful of Earth, Handful of Sky, the World of Octavia E. Butler. It's an incredible book. I savored it chapter by chapter. It's not only beautifully written, but it's just visually so wonderful, and it's just so perfectly put together. So kudos to you, Lynell, for just an excellent book. Before we dive into the questions, I want to tell you a little bit about Lynell George herself. She is a journalist and essayist. After Image, Los Angeles Outside the Frame was her first book of essays and photography, exploring the city where she grew up. As a staff writer for both the LA Times and The Weekly, she focused on social issues, human behavior, visual arts, music, and literature. She taught journalism at Loyola Marymount and in 2013 was named USC Annenberg Getty Arts Journalism Fellow, and in 2017 received the Huntington Library's Alan Jutzi Fellowship for her studies of Octavia Butler. She is a columnist for the KCET Artbound, and her commentary has been featured in numerous news and feature outlets. This is the coolest part of her bio, in my opinion. Her liner notes for Otis Redding Live at the Whiskey A Go-Go earned a 2017 Grammy Award. So welcome, Lynell. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So let's just kind of dive into the book. So I understand you spent several years going through the Octavia Butler collection, which is quite extensive at the Huntington Library. I guess I heard there were maybe 380 or so boxes of things, and that you spent several years there. So I wanted to start out by, how did you tackle doing the research? That just seems like a lot of material to go through.
It really, really was. And I tell people I think there are hundreds of stories in there. I think, any researcher could go in and come up with an original story. There is that much. She saved that much. And I was commissioned in 2016 to do a piece for an arts nonprofit called Clock Shop. And it was a year-long initiative called Radio Imagination. And there were several writers and several artists who worked in the archive. And we were supposed to develop a piece, and mine was very open-ended. It was supposed to be a posthumous interview, and I didn't really know what that was going to be. And I was, and I didn't want it to be a seance. I didn't want it to be woo-woo. I wanted it to be grounded in something, but 380 something boxes. So I knew, since it was going to be her voice, and I wanted to get to intimacy and not her formal voice, not the novels, not the short stories, not the essays. And so I started really looking at, really personal pieces of her archive. So her diaries, her journals. She had different kinds of diaries and journals for different periods of her life, letters, in order to kind of really get at, like, who was the unguarded Octavia Butler? Who was that person? And in doing that, I was able to come up with this piece where she was asking questions of herself, of the world, and answering them herself over time. And there was something about being in that personal voice, like looking at the marginalia, which really just attached to my heart. That's how I started to look at what her day-to-day life was and how she managed her time. And that's when a light bulb went off about, like, oh, this is the research you should do. This is looking at how did she build her life? And so that's what started me down that road.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. So, were you intending to write a book as you were coming out of that radio imagination, or was it?
No, I didn't intend to going in. I really thought I was going to, once I did my piece for Radio Imagination, I thought I would be done, and I was, on to, it was another book project I was working on, and I was doing other, journalism assignments. But something kept talking to me about her writing life, and that's what I wanted. I just thought, there's a book here. I'm not sure exactly yet what it's going to be, but I'd already let the archive tell me what to do. Rather, I didn't go in with this idea. I just thought, I'm going to let the archive talk to me. And that's how this came about.
Yeah, excellent. So, was it, I'm just sort of curious on how you decided on that writer part of her life. Was it, what you saw in the marginalia that was so interesting? And is that what mostly came alive to you in those? Like, what made you focus on the writing aspect?
It was the thing that she talked about in almost everything she worked on in interviews, was how important it was for her to become a writer, and how many barriers there were for that to happen. And even when she was struggling, really young, trying to figure out, like, well, how do I take a writing class? And what do you do to become a professional writer? And she figured out at a very young age, this is the only thing I can do or want to do. I mean, she was really young, like a preteen, I want to be a writer. So it is her essence. So that's why that was interesting to me. It was like, and she did it without having a whole lot to go to make it work, to construct it. So that was the thing that really got me. And I was looking at the tools, how do you make something out of nothing? And that's what she did. And she focused on what she had and not what she didn't have. And she just, like, it was, and that's the other thing I think that was key too. It's like, it wasn't magic, it was hard work, but she did it. And she created a magnificent life for herself.
Yeah, and that really comes across in the book. It's just her drive and her focus, and just the way she seemed to really organize herself around this vision, like, I'm going to do this, period.
Yes.
And the story, like, I just thought that was incredible.
Yeah.
What do you think drew her to science fiction in particular?
Science fiction gave her more room, because she wasn't finding her world or herself reflected in the books that she was reading, period. You know, she made jokes about like Dick and Jane and, you know, and how boring that was. And she said the thing that made her a reader was first, you know, fantasy, and then science fiction. And a pivotal story she tells, you know, is going to see, or turning on the television one afternoon and seeing this terrible science fiction movie called The Devil Girl from Mars. And it was so bad, she said, I knew at a really young age, like, I could do something better than that. And so she tried her hand at it. And, you know, it was clumsy at first, but really the focus, science fiction, literally for her, metaphorically, and then literally later, you know, it raised, you know, it took the roof off and the walls away. And I think, you know, I thought about myself as a young writer too. It's like, I think a lot of writers get into writing because they enjoy creating environments. But for me, and that's just what I recognize about her too, she wrote to make more room for herself and to create characters that she could identify with. And because she didn't see herself, so she always talked about how she had to write herself in. And it started at a very young age.
Yeah. And she was, I mean, you know, we got the Altadena Library here hosting us. I mean, she was a huge library patron. And I mean, I love that she kept, and you've got these great visuals in the book. So she kept all the things that she was checking out from the library, you know, photography. And I mean, can you talk a little bit about some of the things that she checked out and that she kept these wonderful records of?
Well, she used the library in so many different ways. And that was the thing to me that was also really like amazing. And just the other night, I was talking to a small group of people who work. Two of them were librarians, and one of them knew someone who would see her coming into the library all the time, and how focused she was in the library, and like you did not bother Ms. Butler, you know. But it wasn't that she was unfriendly; she was just that focused, and that was what it was. It was like, you know, at that point in her life, she was using the library as an office. You know, it was a place that she went, you know, to make her copies and check out things and double check things. But she had used it through her whole life as either it was graduate school for her, it was where she went to type her manuscripts, it was when she was trying to figure out what is an alternative to writing, like, and not so much that she was going to push everything away, but she said, what else can I do? So a lot of those call slips, for example, are her looking for, you know, other sorts of careers that might mesh with her being a writer, and also mesh with her being, she's shy. And she talked a lot about how she knew that she was, so she had to find the kind of work that would not innervate her emotionally. And so she was looking at the library for that. And then also she researched her first book and wrote it at the LA Public Library. But in Altadena, she read Pasadena Central Library. She read herself through the Peter Pan room, you know, and before she was an adult and could get into the adult room. So she was frustrated because she's like, I'm done and I need to continue. So, but the librarians knew her then and took her around and answered her questions. So she knew her way around libraries. So yeah, so those call slips, yeah, photography. I got lost down a rabbit hole looking at her research for Kindred. And the way she researched Kindred, she did a lot of that research in LA before she went back east to Maryland to do, you know, up close walking through the environment research. But she started her research at LAPL, and you see the evidence of that in the call slips.
Oh my gosh, that's so amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I also just love that you talk in the book about, you know, how she took the bus everywhere, including to the library, and, you know, used it as a way to sort of listen to people and watch people and observe. Like, I mean, you know, I'm super interested in that, and the fact that probably taking that bus, she also saw the incredible diversity of Los Angeles, and you
Absolutely.
know, that sort of strikes me reading her books as well, that you just see this diversity.
Right. Yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how maybe growing up where she did, and taking those bus trips and everything else she did, how did that contribute to how character showed up in her work?
She, you know, it was interesting too, her yearbooks are in the archive. So toward the end, it was interesting because I had read how she would describe her school. And, you know, it was, you know, uh, integrated, you know, but mostly people of color, because it was when Pasadena was, you know, it was before the busing started. And um, so it's interesting, even at a very early age, she had decided that she wanted to speak other languages because, you know, she had um, um, fellow students who spoke Spanish. And so you see it in her journal, you know, she will write a few pages in Spanish and she'll, you know, test it out. And then to look at the photos in the yearbook, and I thought, okay, she described that really accurately, you know, even from a young age. So she was looking and listening and trying to pick up textures and sound, and there was no way. I just thought she just absorbed everything, and that you know, we became, you know, we got the gift of that, you know, her eye and her ear. And so yes, you see, you know, this vivid community, you know, in her work,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
people
and I mean,
working
she also,
together, and people working together. Yeah.
yes, yeah, exactly. You know, you also talk about how much of a news junkie she was, and I
Yeah.
sometimes think like, how would she be reacting to the news of the
Oh,
last
God.
several years? I mean, I
she
can't
probably
imagine.
she probably would have had trouble working, I mean, honestly, because that's news. She was so addicted to the news, that she would say she would have to put herself on a news diet, and if she was working on a manuscript, because she said, I know I will just overdo it. And I think this environment, you know how we're all feeling like, you know, overwhelmed by the news. She would absolutely be overwhelmed by the news, but she would get up in the morning and she would read her paper and listen to NPR, and or, you know, go on a walk and listen to the news, and then come home. And then, but when it really started to get to be closer to her deadline, she was like, I'm going to listen to music, I'm going to listen to classical music, or I'm going to listen to this, to just sort of chill her brain out, you know, so she could actually, you know, work and move her characters around and be in their heads.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, loved how she kind of talked about, people would say, well, you seem like you're a clairvoyant, you know, like people would read her things and then think, and she would just say, you know, this is what anybody reading the news would sort of see
Right. I'm
is
just paying
happening. That
attention.
was
She
really
always
cool.
would say, I'm just paying attention.
She's paying attention.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so, I mean, reading your book, I also just get the sort of sense that she seemed like an alien herself to in her community. I mean, I don't know what it was that sort of gave me that impression, but you know, it seemed like maybe that would have drawn her to the whole science fiction genre. I mean, do you have the same sense that, you know, she maybe felt really kind of out of place in some ways?
I feel, yes, I mean, she felt out of place, but in a more like, it's almost like people hadn't caught up to her. And it was like that. And it's been interesting in this process because you know, part of because I'm a reporter, um, I would go out of the archive and try to go and look at the places she was in to see, like, okay, what must it have felt like to be her in this place. I've talked to some people who, you know, at some of the schools who once knew her, and they talk about how she was quiet and she stayed to herself. Again, you know, back to the shyness and in being an introvert and being in her head. That was the other thing. But the thing that I think really struck me is that I wish there was more, and I think there would be now. I just feel like if there was more space for her, you know, then it's like she was carving out new roads, new paths, new ways of being, you know, just by showing up, you know. So now it would be different. There are more people who are, you know, Black women who are writing science fiction, fantasy, horror, um, back then it's like, oh, she's into science fiction. What is that? Like, as a Black woman, like that was not, you know, so she kept it to herself, and not as a secret. I mean, people who knew her knew that, but it was sort of like, it's too much to explain. So I think in that way, she was, super isolated.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, I kind of just feel like, yeah, now it would be different, but she got through it.
Yeah. Well, and set the path for
Yeah.
many women who could come after her. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just amazing. I mean, I'm kind of curious too about things that might have been happening in her youth. In particular, the Watts uprising was happening when she was a late teenager. Lots of the school integration, the Pasadena
Right.
system was happening. Do you sort of see evidence of that appearing in her work or in her journals? Did she talk about those kinds of things?
She I wish I could say, like I read all of them. I read a lot, believe me, and there are things I went back to because once I focused on things. But yeah, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, there's an entry in her journal about that. She talked about when she went to Pasadena City College, and she also went to Cal State LA, and she joined the Afro-American club there, and she was involved. And so there are these newspapers and flyers and magazines, and she was in meetings. And so there are minutes. And so this was something that she was consciously aware of. You see little snippets of things in these asides, and these are the things that really would tug at my heart about, her being in Pasadena or Altadena, or I think this is Pasadena. A new bookstore opened, and she peeked her head in, and she wanted to know if she was allowed to go in there, as a little Black girl. Like, was that okay for her? And the owner said, yes, you can come in. But she said, I just wasn't sure, because her mother was really cautious with her too. She didn't want her, from Louisiana, and she referred to her mother as being Louisiana cautious. And but that's how, and that's what was so, to me, very effective about it. The way things came up, they would come up in her journal about, some sort of tension or fear that she had about doing something. And then there's this internalized, emotion that happens, like even in her classes, where she felt that people just didn't think she was smart and thought she was slow. And even though sometimes she doesn't say outright, it's about race, sometimes she does. And she is wondering, is like, I'm this Black girl sitting in the back of the class, and they don't think much of me. They don't, so that's the way it comes up.
Yeah. But also sort of interesting that she seemed to have some real allies that helped her, a teacher who helped her type up one of her manuscripts.
Yeah, that one was, and it was the teacher that you wouldn't have expected too. Like, she went to an English teacher and asked her, and she didn't, but it was her science teacher who said, sure. And because she said she didn't know how to type, and she had to wait a couple of grades, because again, she was ahead of everybody else. They had caught up with her. She had to wait for a typing class, but she wanted to enter this contest. And this teacher typed her short story for her. Wow. And as she said, she goes, I didn't win the contest, but you could see that helped her inside, like she won something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's amazing. I also loved how she talked about the past as another planet. I mean, I just think that's so wonderful. And I kind of wonder, even thinking about Parable of the Sower, like there are things that I just sort of wonder, how much did she change what science fiction was at the time and what it could be?
Yeah. I mean, I think for her, it was, she was, as she said, and it is interesting, as much as she will sometimes say in an interview that, she doesn't think of her work as science fiction, that, like, and she would point to Kindred and say, there's no science in Kindred. The time slipping is not a machine. It's, we don't know how Dana is slipping. That's the unknown. And she would call it a dark fantasy. I think she was defining things as she went. And that was sort of the beauty, because it's like, okay, if I am going to be the only one, and I've been trying to fit myself somewhere, I'm going to just do what I want and create these strong women characters. And they're flawed, and they're therefore human, that you can relatable in that sense. So yeah, I think she was just she's just going to see what she could tease out.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, just so brilliantly done. I mean, one of the things that I just thought was, what I love about this book. I mean, so many things, but one of them is you really did bring her to life. Like you could feel the full roundedness of her as a person, including, I think often we get these stories of, she figured out what she wanted to do and then she just did it, and you really get into the struggle and the financial trouble that she had, and even the self-doubt after she was published and winning
Yeah.
prizes, and
Yeah.
I sort of wondering, how did you approach that as a writer? How did you kind of bring her to life? How did you kind of do that?
I think the experience of sitting and looking at somebody's very, very personal thoughts, which is different from, even as a reporter, if I had been able to spend a week, 2 weeks, a month, a year, following her, because sometimes you're lucky and you can do that kind of a profile. I would never have known what I now know about her because of these papers. And I think that's the thing that was so mind-blowing, and also made it difficult too, because it's like, I was in her head, in her arm as she was writing. I was like, it was this, I was, yeah, she was a vessel, that I was occupying. So I knew, and I didn't know how I was going to do this, that this book should be, I'm writing it, but I really wanted her voice to be, at the forefront. And it was trying to figure out which one of them, because Octavia is a little girl, Octavia is a teen, Octavia looking back at being a girl. I wasn't really sure. And again, back to like letting the archive tell me and letting her tell me. And the thing that really struck me when you were talking about the financial trouble and that sort of thing, I thought, this is the piece that will speak to people. Anybody, you don't have to be a writer. You don't even have to be somebody who would consider themselves creative. All of us have a spark of creativity in living our lives and trying to manage how we, move through our lives and pay our bills and be ourselves. And there was something in that, to me, that was extremely powerful, is seeing her constantly get up and push through. And some days were really hard, and it was familiar, and I thought, this is what people need to see. As you said, people go like, it should be a straight line, and it's never a straight line. And she had so many moments where, like, it took her 5 years. She published this book, and then it took her 5 years to be published again. And some people would have quit, and that's the thing I feel like is so powerful about her story, is that she kept figuring out ways to continue. And with the bills mounting, with, having to call somebody and say, where's my money? And she was, again, this took everything out of her, because she hated having to be, confrontational even. And she had to pay long distance phone call for a long distance phone call to get her money, because it was back in the day where you had to do that. So I thought people would really appreciate knowing all these pieces, because it took a lot for her to be Octavia E. Butler.
Yeah. So I think we'll open the chat up if you want to start putting your questions into the chat. I've got a few more questions and then we'll open it up, but we want to give you some time to think about your question and get it in there. So Chloe, let's go ahead and open that and let people go in there. Just to go back to these papers, I think one thing that I really was impressed by was how lucky we are that she saved them. How lucky we are that she didn't throw away what she checked out from the library, or what she, her bus pass, or just all these wonderful things.
Yeah.
And at the same time, she lived in Pasadena. She lived for a while in Altadena. She
Yes.
moved out to Washington.
Yes.
She must have moved the stuff with her wherever she went, which I
That's
think
what I was thinking. She had to move all that stuff. Because it didn't sound like she had a storage facility, especially in the early part. It's like she had all this stuff. And I talked to people who have visited her, and they said, yes, she had, a lot of books and a lot of, papers and file cabinets. And there's even descriptions in the archive about, where she's drawn a map of when she's getting ready to move, where she's going to put things.
wow.
And she always, that was, part of that visualization that I loved seeing, because you would happen upon, instead of a journal entry, she would do a list of wishes about what she would want her house to look like, or what, and she always wanted an office. She always, every wish was like she needed a place to do her work, to write, and it was comfortable, and it was hers, and it was, the door, so that she wasn't like shoved into another room. And I so get that.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, just all the self-affirmations too. You would think that what I really liked about, again, this book, and just the sense you give of her, is that she didn't grow into some crazy ego where she thought, no, I'm going to throw away anything that might make me seem vulnerable. Like, she just seemed like she owned her vulnerabilities, and she had these self-affirmations that I thought were wonderful. Just to read how she really propped herself up and kept herself moving forward was wonderful.
Yeah.
So how did you, I mean, incorporating a lot of the stuff from the archive, how did you decide how to visually sort of lay out the book and incorporate some of these things? Because again, I think that's part of the magic of this book, is you've got this beautiful writing that you've done, but also the visual accompaniment. So how did you kind of put that together and think about that?
I had to really, because once again, 380 boxes and then thousands of pieces that I had touched. And I had to start thinking about the things that she used, again, back to the word tool, what were the things that she either used every day, or that, or she needed. And that's how I began to pare things down. It's like, because a handful of earth, a handful of sky, was her answer when people would ask her, well, what does science fiction mean to you? What is science fiction? And she said, science fiction is a handful of earth, a handful of sky, and everything around and in between. And when I hit that quote, and I thought, yes, so she's trying to ground it so people understand. It's like, it really is what we live every day, and I'm just tilting it. And then I thought about it's a recipe too. And as was her life. So if I start looking at the objects, what does she touch every day? What does she, so, the bus pass, the library card, especially during different periods of her life. And then later, calendars. Calendars were really important to her. Time was important to her, because she was sometimes working full-time, going to school, and trying to write during the day. So the way she used calendars was really different from the way that I will just like, oh, poop, I have an interview, I have this, I have that, dinner, coffee. But she was doing her page counts. She was looking both in the future and in the past at the same time. And there's so much life in these calendars. So that's how I started to look at things like, what were the things that she absolutely needed to get her around. And then when she becomes famous, then we have, I wanted to use her passport, but it was even better to use her boarding passes,
Yeah.
to see where she was going, and that was a big deal, for someone who didn't drive, and, for a long time was just up here in the San Gabriel Valley. And then, when she got brave enough, she's taking that bus downtown to downtown LA and going to speak and this and that. So her world kept getting bigger, but she had to push it, and she did it with these tools.
Yeah, it was wonderful to see the sort of, she starts as this poor girl in Pasadena, but then you see the boarding pass where she's going to, I think it was Scotland. And I mean, really amazing. So is there anything that, as you were going through and writing this book or researching it, that really surprised you, or that you learned that,
I keep telling this to people because it's really true. I had no idea what her sense of humor is like, you see this very, I mean, you know, she often didn't smile in photographs. She hated to have her picture taken. So you see this very stern, but she had this really like wry sense of humor. I talk about how she, with these date books too, like there would be like an affirmation from some famous person, and she would, on that, in the little square, she would like do a talk back, you know, with with the question, you know, like, but it would be funny. And just the way she would react to events. And she wasn't this very serious, I mean, she was, but she wasn't that way, you know, 24/7, 365. And I think seeing that opened doors to seeing all these other things that she was too, you know. So that, and yeah, in the saving, and how important that was. And I think that's the other part about, you know, people have asked me, you know, why do I suppose that she saved all of those things? I think a lot of it has to do with self-documentation, and how she had evidence of the things she had gotten through. And especially I can see with manuscripts or letters, or like the things that happen in the classroom. I think having that and knowing she had moved past it, there's something about like, here, this is, I got past this, you know, even for herself.
Yeah, nice. So what's next for you? Are you doing more on Octavia Butler, or what's your next project?
Right now I'm in a thicket of freelance writing. I've just finished some liner notes for another album, which I can't talk about yet. But you know, working on a piece about music in LA, working on a couple of profiles. There's a book, the book that I was gonna go work on, I'm gonna revisit it and see where it is in my head. But yeah, it's COVID has sort of, you know, shifted things. So I don't know. And who knows, there may be another Octavia project, but you know, I'm not sure yet.
Yeah. All right, great. So I think, Chloe, it looks like we've gotten some questions in. Do you want to help us just bring up some of the audience questions?
Absolutely. So Meredith has heard that Octavia had a special connection to horses. Did that show through at all in her diaries?
Yes, there are lovely, lovely moments. Like she made a friend who had a horse, and there's this very absolutely moving memory of, she loved to go, she would beg to go on these pony rides. And so one day she went and she noticed that the ponies were bruised, you know, and when she realized, like, you know, what was happening, you know, this is the way they were treated, and having, you know, a bunch of little kids on them, and in the way they were, you know, being managed, she's like, I just decided I didn't want to be on these ponies, because that was not good for them. So she preferred to write her pony stories for that time. But one of my favorite photographs of her, absolute favorite photographs of her, is, it looks like it's probably taken in the Pacific Northwest, and because it's this beautiful green meadow, and there's this horse that she's got her arm around, and this smile is like nothing I have ever seen. It's this $1 million smile, her and this horse. But yeah, I mean, this love of horses, it started at the very beginning of her life, you know, and that's why she was writing these horse stories as a kid. And the fact that she got up there and was able to be, you know, in big skies and big green. So yes, it does come up a lot in the early writings.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is not as much a question, but maybe you could speak to it. I heard that she used her middle name in order to keep her real self more private.
The way the middle name emerges in the archive is, well, when her mother's name was Octavia as well, and Octavia Margaret, and she was Octavia Estelle. And so at home, people referred to her as Estelle. and Junie, that was one of her nicknames. And when she became more known, she wanted to use the Estelle in and is her middle name, you know, as I mean, in just the E. And so there's all of this documentation in the archive where she has to remind people, you know, Octavia E. Butler, please do not forget my middle initial. And the Octavia was in the beginning, there's this really beautiful journal entry where she is realizing that, you know, in order for me to be the person I need to be in public, I have to be different from Estelle. I have to grow. You know, so she starts playing with things like, you know, Octavia would wear high heels and dresses. Estelle may not, but Octavia will. Octavia will have to. So it becomes a way for her to, again, write herself in, create a character. So for her to, you know, inhabit and live. And that journal entry was very powerful to me.
Thank you very much. Did you come across any nearly finished drafts of stories that may possibly be published one day?
There are lots and lots and lots of drafts of things, but I know and I don't know because she was very particular about what she wanted the world to see. And that's the thing that as a writer, I feel like that was sometimes some of the hardest things to look at is like looking at her drafts because she was very meticulous. There are things that she'd gotten pretty far on and you know, projects, and then she would just I'm not feeling this, you know. She was trying to write a memoir and I'm like, yes. And so it was interesting, but then she was like, I'm just not feeling it. So I don't know if there's enough to finish it, but there is a lot of stuff there, and maybe if there's some notes and, you know, that help to fill things in, but there's a lot there.
Thank you. Arden asks, in your book, you talk about the shape-shifting narrative of her life. Can you talk about that a little more?
In specifically the idea of she had to be so many different people in order to eventually be herself. And that's the thing that for me, that was so inspiring. I know what it's like to want to be a writer. You know, I'm younger than Octavia was. I'm sorry, I was like, yeah, I'm younger than Octavia. I'm, you know, a generation down. And I've often thought about like, I had role models, you know. I looked at someone like the poet Wanda Coleman, you know, because she was somebody that I went to see. But I think about her, it's like she had to figure out and try on all these different guises in order to finally arrive at, you know, Octavia. And it was so inspiring to read this because she was kind of she was knocking around in the dark trying to do this. And I often, you know, and especially in the hardest moments, and where she was trying to explain to friends and family what she wanted to do. And then there's this moment where she's just going, you know, I'm going to keep my own counsel. And she would take these part-time jobs, you know, working telemarketing and, you know, actually like, you know, working in the stock room at department stores because she wanted to. So she was all these different people in all these different places, and didn't talk about the things that were at her heart. And I think about walking around like that and holding all this stuff in and what that must have been like for her. So her to finally find a community after she goes to Clarion, and for the science fiction workshop, you can feel this relief on the pages. It's like, I found another little piece of myself. I don't have to keep secrets. And even then, she was the, you know, only Black woman. But I think she'd already gone through the crucible of trying to explain to people who really didn't understand what she was strong then, stronger then because of it. So yeah, so she did all of this shape shifting in order to get to be herself.
Thank you. And it's a perfect segue. You talked a little bit about your own journey as a writer, and Gail asks, having been so touched by all the things that Octavia preserved, are you considering what you yourself will say for those in the future who will want to know more about you?
It's a really good question because I'm wrestling with that. One of the curators I know at the Huntington she asked me too. She said, what are you thinking? You should stop throwing things away. And I think about the things that I've already tossed, and I really regret it after spending time in her archive. And they're not even my personal things. They're because I'm a journalist. I've interviewed so many people, hundreds of people, and because of space or we're being worried about technology, I've tossed things. I stopped doing that. Now I have to go and want to get some tapes preserved, but then I'm also thinking about my own drafts and my letters and my photographs, in particular photographs. I have photographs of what LA used to look like, and thinking these belong someplace. So now, yes, it's making me much more aware of what needs to be saved, and that those shows, Hoarders, I don't know if it was like somebody was saying, what if Octavia had seen that show, Hoarders, would she have like dumped everything? I said, no, it wouldn't have affected her, I don't think. She was on a path.
Thank you. It looks like we have one more question coming in. Growing up, what was Octavia's relationship with her mother and father?
Her father died early, so her mother was raised by her mother. They were extremely close, and Octavia, when was asked like who her inspirations were, she always would mention her mother and her grandmother. Her mom bought her first typewriter, and it was seen as an extravagance. Her mother was the person who actually told her she should be a writer, kind of put that in her head. And because Octavia was telling stories to herself, that she would make up, and she would memorize them. And, and then she and her mom would be out doing something, and she realized when she was telling the story to her mother, that she'd forgotten parts of her stories. And her mother said, then you should write them down. And that's what started it. So her mom was really instrumental, if not, even though she didn't fully understand, it wasn't so much she didn't understand writing and what writing in book, because she's the one that took her to the library the first time, but this passion, about like, I want to do this full time. I want to be a professional writer. And it was like, no, you need to find something that, you can fall back on. You need a job that gives you good insurance and a paycheck. And, this is, walking out on a limb. But her mother believed in her enough and her passion enough to keep supporting this. And this idea of like, you should write your stories down. You should be a writer. That took.
Great, thank you. We have just a couple more quick ones before we wrap up. As you talk about typing on a typewriter or otherwise, Josh is wondering, he heard that she used to handwrite her stories in the park. Is there any merit to that?
Probably. I was so impressed. She started, I think the earliest journal entry I see, like that I can remember just off the top of my head, I'd have to look. She was really young, where she would plan her weekends around her writing. I think she was 11, like, I'm going to read my book and then I'm going to do some writing. And that at that point, it would have been, taking it to the park and writing longhand. I mean, people recognized her as the tall girl who was always writing, so, I thought, okay, so she, and she made an impression. So I think that would absolutely be true. And you can see evidence of that back to the calendars. She would calendar out her time, even her weekend time, and would feel upset if she didn't have time to read and write as a kid.
Oh, wow. I love that.
I know, it's wonderful. It's so great.
Just a couple more. How has Octavia's description and memorabilia of Altadena, Pasadena, and the LA area had an effect on how you view this place?
It's so funny you asked that. I cannot look at the San Gabriel Mountains and not think of her now.
Hmm.
Not at all. Like this morning, I got up to go run for doctor's appointment, and he's in Altadena, and parked my car, rushing, but I paused and looked because there are Octavia San Gabes, as she called them. Yeah, absolutely. And especially now the library, I think about her all the time. If I run in there, yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you. And maybe we call this, we have a thank you for that in the chat.
You're welcome.
Maybe we call this the final question just for sake of time, if this works. How did her experiences with religion affect her works, particularly the parables of the sower and the talents?
Octavia says many, many times in her journals and interviews and everything that she's not religious, and she identified as an atheist. So the parables are actually, but her mother was extremely religious. And so she grew up going to church and would go to church with her mother, even after she had made this declaration to the family. But she knew the power of church, and the Earth Seed started as her like kind of dabbling in poetry, at first, and that sort of thing. But that was her way. Yeah, that was her way in. It was more, I found this one item which is so interesting. I thought she's really provocative little girl. I mean, she had written out a questionnaire for her mother and some other people, I guess, who were present. And it had everything to do with, she had questions about religion, and she was young. This is sometime in the late 60s. And I could see the line where her mother like hadn't answered the question, or she just said, I'm skipping this one, but she was curious. So she was definitely engaged in it. But that was her mother's beliefs and not hers.
Well, thank you very much. This was wonderful. It was great talking to you. I just want to encourage folks to go and get this book. Chloe put a link to get it at a discounted rate. It's really just an incredible book. So thank you so much, Lynell George, for spending time with us this evening and for sharing your insights. This was really wonderful. Thank you.
For having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you at the next Altadena Historical Society program.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.